Mehdi Hasan was able to interview former Senator Joe Lieberman. Sinema's sociopathy is so strong that you can find all these old transcripts and quotes of her talking about Joe Lieberman and how he's just obstructing all the things that the Democrats want, and how he's basically not a Democrat, and just going after Joe Lieberman. And now that she's in power, she's serving functionally the same exact role that Joe Lieberman did. So time to reflect a little bit on Joe Lieberman and he's worse than both of those individuals, Manchin and Sinema, because of his complicity in the Iraq War. Now, you might think, okay, the Iraq War is an abject disaster. Everybody in the country thinks so. Internationally made the United States a joke. We killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis. We devastated their infrastructure. We made sure that they didn't have any clean water. We undermined any faith in their government so that there is mass non-participation in elections. We spurned the rise of ISIS due to our involvement, let alone the tens of thousands of United States soldiers that we killed and the geopolitical disaster that it birthed. But Joe Lieberman thinks it was still a good idea.
Have you shifted on the Iraq war? Before I let you go, I got to ask you about Iraq. We just saw the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the end of the Afghan war. You have someone like Chris Murphy now representing Connecticut that you sat in for the Senate. He's very critical of the Iraq war. Have you disowned it? You know, as recently as 2015, 2016, you were still saying you thought it was a good thing overall. It was a disaster. Are you willing to say tonight it was a disaster, you were wrong, you regret it, you apologize?
Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm not. I mean, look, I was in the majority of members of the Senate Democratic Caucus who voted to authorize President Bush to go to war in Iraq to get rid of Saddam Hussein. After the war, after Saddam went into hiding until we caught him, the Bush administration made some big mistakes. And that went to the whole way in which they handled the Iraqi military, the Iraqi government. But my point of contention with a bunch of my fellow Democrats who turned against the war then was that we can't just cut funding for our troops in battle, which is what a couple of Democrats tried to do, and I was the decisive vote against.
But come on, it was.
And we can't leave this battlefield in defeat because it'll until we stabilize the country. And frankly, we did. That actually happened.
But hold on. I have to ask this. We're out of time, but I have to jump in here. Thousands of Iraqis died, innocent men, women, children, civilians, in U.S. airstrikes, in massacres in places like Haditha, Memudiyah, Balad. I asked John Bolton this same question almost exactly a year ago on this show. Does none of that bother you? Doesn't affect your conscience? Doesn't keep you up at night? The sheer level of suffering that we caused in Iraq?
Yeah, but of course it does. But the truth is that the people of Iraq were suffering terribly under Saddam Hussein, and so were the people of the region.
I'm sorry, pause it. I'm sorry. I mean, or maybe we should finish, but I just like I wish Mehdi does a great job asking that question and nobody else in media is asking these questions. But the idea that we're going to still let these ghouls, these evil people, get away with Saddam Hussein was a bad man and they were living under tyranny. We're going to let them get away with that talking point. Decades before, we were working with Saddam Hussein as a part of our own international colonial efforts because we saw him as a willing partner for the West. And as soon as he didn't actually help us in our capitalist efforts and he was being a bit more savvy with Iraq's oil fields, we turned on him. And that is the reason why he's been demonized. Was Saddam Hussein a good man? He was brutal. Yes, he was a head of state who presided over a variety of atrocities, much like our allies in Saudi Arabia, much like our own leaders in the United States. We decided to create this years-long propaganda effort to build him up as this big evil villain, so people like Joe Lieberman are able to cover their ass and pretend like what we did in Iraq wasn't an atrocity of epic proportions, because it's not true that Saddam Hussein was so evil and this like bonds like villain that we had no choice but to murder hundreds of thousands of his own civilians and devastate their infrastructure to a point where Iraq went from being a more modern state in the 1970s in the Middle East to where it's at now, which is a completely unstable country because of our involvement, not just in the Iraq War, but in the Gulf War previously, where we destabilized it to the point that we could finish the job under Bush too. What we have done there is unimaginable. And the fact that this, I mean, except that it happened, and the fact that this man has zero remorse about it is like, it sickens me to watch.
I just want to quickly focus on what he said so far. He tries to defend himself by saying he just voted alongside the majority of the Democratic Senate caucus. And yes, guess what? They were wrong too. The idea that you're absolved because you just went with everybody along with everybody else. If that, but then the real thing that was amazing to me was when he goes ahead and says, it was then the Bush administration that ended up with all the mess ups and screw ups. Yeah. You empowered them to do that. You gave them the authority with your vote in the Senate. If you entrusted the Bush administration, George Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Colin Powell, you entrusted them with your vote to carry this out. And guess what? That means you are responsible for what they end up doing. Thank you very much.
I just want to set the record straight. I know I agree with both of you, what you said so far. And, because Hasan says thousands of Iraqis die. It's at least 500,000 Iraqis died as a result of, the invasion of Iraq by the United States. And the other part of it is just, it's just such a low bar that we have. Not only just that this question wouldn't be asked to Joe Lieberman probably on any other, show he would be on, but that even matters. Who cares how he feels about what his role was in, contributing to the death of 500,000 people? It would be nice if he had remorse, but remorse certainly isn't the same thing as accountability. In reality, the lack of remorse and the lack of being, not asked about their remorse is just so people in the media can feel good about continuing to cycle them around these shows. And, him showing some sort of self-actualization doesn't make any of what he did okay. Theoretically, in a real country that had real laws and really cared about human rights, it would be a mitigating factor in his, war crimes trial, right? But to, him not even be able to engage in even the most performative remorse because of what it would cost him personally, and then for it also to just not really matter, even if he had, it's it's just a low bar. I can say that it doesn't make it disgust me, but it wouldn't have made me think too much better of him that he said he did feel remorse. But it is what it is, I suppose. We can't do anything about these people, and all we can try to do is again, Joe Lieberman. Bush has been rehabilitated. Bush is cycling around on these shows soon. Maybe he'll be on Mehdi's show and he'll ask him if he feels bad about the Iraq war, and he'll say, I sure do. And then I guess people can feel good or bad about that, but it doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change the fact that we're continuing down that same path, and we haven't really in any way put on any new brakes or added any new stoppers to the system to prevent it from happening again.
Well, the Biden administration says Iraq was a disaster. He regretted his vote, and that he rightly withdrew out of Afghanistan because that war was also a disaster. He has not repealed the AUMF. Talk about putting brakes on the situation. The Biden administration has still presided over the twin authorization for the use of military force, which allows the president to have this extreme authority to essentially wage whatever war that they want. So if he was actually fundamentally interested in putting brakes on the situation and preventing the United States from doing something, he wouldn't have just withdrawn from Afghanistan, which was the correct thing to do, and he deserves praise for it, but he would have put something structural in place. The reality is that these power brokers want the ability to do another Iraq. And as you both point out so aptly, one, it doesn't necessarily matter if they feel remorse, but two, this could happen again. Biden's currently doing this pivot to China where we're ramping up this militaristic rhetoric towards one of the biggest powers in the world because it makes sense electorally, and it's a bipartisan effort, just like we saw then, pretending as if China, which has something like 8 military bases to our over 700 military bases internationally, presents some sort of military threat, when in reality it's an economic threat. And so the powers that be drive this up, ramp this up irresponsibly because it threatens capital, and they want to have this kind of Cold War type capitalistic rivalry with China because that helps people and it drives up interest in competing with China. And it's irresponsibly wielded. And now there are no structural barriers in place to prevent something like this from happening again. So, you know, people don't even necessarily realize how much military presence we have in Africa right now. That could be the next frontier for the country that we decimate. And not to get too hung up on this, it's just this enrages me so much. Like when Lieberman says we help stabilize the country, we took a vase, we shattered it on the ground, and like put a Band-Aid over it. That's stabilizing the country? You deliberately shattered it. You shattered it. And you did it twice. I mean, it was like, yeah, in 1990, and then let's do it again in 2003. And we're going to kill hundreds of thousands of people and children and shorten life expectancy and create disease and famine and all of these things because oil.
Yeah, and also the explicit goal of the United States government, I mean, not explicit, but despite the explicit goal of the United States government, the goal of our foreign policy project in the Middle East and Africa has never been any kind of real stability. It's always been to, increase chaos in a way that makes it easier to extract resources, natural resources for them. I think your point about Africa, Emma, is a good one because Biden ended the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, I guess, is kind of over too. But we're still engaged in multiple shadow wars in Iraq. I mean, not Iraq, in Africa. We're still engaged in funding the continued genocide in Yemen. We're still engaged in multiple other imperialist and coup projects globally. And so, focusing too much on how people feel about the two wars that we actually, I guess, went about the sort of right way, just I think does a disservice to how much, the war machine in America and the people who get rich off it have been unabated by the end of Afghanistan or the end of Iraq in any real way. We're still killing people abroad. It's just those are the two wars you hear most about in media.
Right. I mean, that's the real worrying thing, isn't it? Most people probably know that we went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq, regardless of what they know about it. Most people probably can tell you, if it doesn't even matter if they know which war is still going on or which war isn't. They know it happened and that we went to war. All those other ones that you just mentioned, most people got no clue, which is the scariest thing. We're doing this without the majority of our own citizens even realizing that it even happened to begin with.
Yeah, Obama was in many ways the drone president, and under the Obama era, for a lot of reasons, we started hearing less about the expansion of wars because there wasn't the huge cost to American lives the way there was when we first invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and the various surges that happened prior to, the ramping up of the drone warfare attacks in the rest of the Middle East and Northern Africa. So, I mean, I think there's a fear that we might get ourselves involved in another explicit quagmire, but there's also the very real fear that, they've learned from the fact that we can just engage in many shadow wars or drone warfare programs without it ever really triggering the media at home because Americans don't really die in them. I remember a few years ago when that one soldier died in a shadow war in Africa and we were hearing about it on the news and it was do we have boots on the ground in, the Democratic Republic of Congo? Or are we supposed to be there? But I think that we're not going to be called upon to have as much empathy for the veterans of those shadow wars either, even as they come home from a war that they weren't even supposed to be fighting, essentially.